Hi, everyone. Welcome to the American Cornerstone Institute's Cornerstone Conversation. We're really excited about our conversation today on the administrative state. We have some great guests with us today. Dr. Philip Hamburger, the Maurice and Hilda Friedman Professor of Law at Columbia Law School. He teaches and writes on wide-ranging topics, including religious liberty, freedom of speech and press, academic censorship, the regulation of science, judicial duty, administrative power, and the development of liberal thought. In two recent books is Administrative Law Unlawful and The Administrative Threat, which I like to call the Cliff Notes version of Administrative Law Unlawful. He argues that the administrative state is unconstitutional and a threat to civil liberties. In his latest book, Liberal Suppression, Section 501c3, and the Taxation of Speech, he shows that the Revenue Code's restriction on political speech of churches were initially proposed by the imperial wizard of the Ku Klux Klan and shows that speech limitations are unconstitutional. In 2014, Hamburger established the Law School Center for Law and Liberty, which studies threats to and legal protections for freedom. He is the founder and president of the New Civil Liberties Alliance, an independent, nonprofit civil rights organization based in Washington, D.C. It uses litigation and other pro bono advocacy to defend constitutional freedoms from the administrative state. Welcome, Philip.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here.
Great, thank you. And of course, we have Dr. Ben Carson, our founder and chair of the American Cornerstone Institute, world-renowned neurosurgeon, and Presidential Medal of Freedom recipient. Hi, Dr. Carson.
Hi, Evelyn. Thank you for doing this again.
Absolutely. So we wanted to talk about the administrative state today and its influence on our lives. Dr. Carson, did you want to open?
Well, this is a very important topic, and I'm so delighted that Dr. Hamburger is with us here today, who has really been a vocal advocate of the Constitution and doing things the right way, and having legal scholars who still believe that is very encouraging to us who are not legal scholars. But, our system, I think, is miraculous. I think it was inspired by God. Our Constitution is so well put together, but it was intended that our country be run by the will of the people. It was supposed to be of, by, and for the people. But obviously, you can't have millions of people saying what their opinion is, so they all have representatives. And therefore, we have a democratic republic with representatives so that it can, in fact, be run by the people. What has happened gradually, more since the 20s, the 1920s, is that a group of people who are not elected representatives of the people have begun to fashion the policies and manipulate the laws and take over the courts. And so we don't really have as much of a system of people representation as was intended. We still have it, but it's been contaminated. And the question is, can it be resurrected to be what it was intended to be? Because what I've found as I've traveled around this country is that the American people actually are pretty smart, and they actually have a lot of common sense. And if we informed them correctly, they will make very, very good decisions. That brings you to, a whole nother area, and that is the press. The press is the only business that is protected by a constitution. And there was a reason for that. It's because they were supposed to disseminate unbiased information to the populace so that they could determine what their will is. How can they determine what their will is if they don't have the information? But when the press decides to put their thumb on that scale and to become an agent of one philosophy or another, or one ideology or another, it completely distorts the way that things were designed to be, and it's having a deleterious effect. And it doesn't matter whether it's conservative press or liberal press, they really should concentrate on the truth and on unbiased information and disseminating that. And I think that would probably go a long way toward helping us to solve this problem. But I'm most anxious to hear what Dr. Hamburger has to say about that.
Well, I agree with you that the truth will out. I just hope it comes out soon enough. Right? I suppose that's why we're here, to talk about it, isn't it? In the case of the administrative state, I think for 100 years or so, there was never sufficient discussion of it, even before our current political correctness, because it was so much a product of the knowledge class, the academic class. They didn't really want to talk about its seamier side. It's a strange beast, isn't it? It's, we have a constitution, and it's based on principles such as the law should not have obligation unless there's consent, through elective consent through Congress, and that adjudications don't bind us unless there's a judge, a jury, and due process. And somehow the administrative state avoids all of this. It binds us through the edicts of unelected bureaucrats, and the same bureaucrats then also adjudicate decisions when we violate the rules that they make. For example, the commissioners of the SEC not only make the rules that bind us instead of Congress, they also prosecute instead of the Justice Department, and then they're the ultimate deciders in adjudications when they go after you for enforcement proceedings. And there's no judge, no jury, no due process. In fact, one of their heads of their little tribunals said that basically you're presumed guilty. You have to prove your innocence. So it's a strange world. You're right. We still have something of the republic. We have the shell of a republic, but within that, there's this strange thing that's arisen, this strange beast, this administrative beast that is an utter threat to our voting rights, because we vote, but the people we elect don't make the laws, and to our procedural rights. So it's very disturbing.
No question about that. And, it even impacts the way that we communicate, our speech. And it's reached a point where we have not the government restricting people's speech, but agents of the government restricting people's speech, which essentially leads you to the same place. And, one of the reasons I think that America was so attractive to so many people from so many places is that you could have your own thoughts and you could express them, and you wouldn't wind up in jail or in today's culture being canceled or having some deleterious impact on your family. And that's one of the reasons that it's so important for people to have an understanding of what is happening, and also to recognize that people have to get involved. You cannot be the land of the free if you're not the home of the brave. If you always sit in the corner and expect that someone else is going to fight the battle for you, you're going to lose your freedom. And just to think about how rapidly it occurs. I'm reminded of my visits to Venezuela many times for conferences and other things. And it was a beautiful place with beautiful resorts and hotels and museums and shopping centers. And it seemed like the biggest controversy there that the people always got involved in is whether or not they were the most beautiful people in the world. This was their big issue. And to go from the #1 economy in South America to the last almost overnight. It's just sort of what happens when you remove from the people the power to control their own destiny and put it in the hands of people who actually think that they know better. And that's part of the problem with the administrative class. they think they're doing everybody a favor because they are intellectually superior and they actually know what's good for you. You don't really know what's good for you.
I was going to say, current policy does not give me great confidence in that theory. I mean, if you look at our economy, our debt, our social ailments, I can't say our betters have done a very good job, right?
No, absolutely not. And when you think about our future,
Hmm.
and really that's what we should be thinking about. You know, it was Thomas Jefferson who said, it's immoral to borrow from future generations. What would he think if he could see what was going on here today?
Yeah.
Just massive borrowing of money that we don't have that will clearly have an impact on the future of those who are coming after us. Have we no concern whatsoever for them?
Right. I think the Supreme Court is somewhat to blame here. I never want to be hard on the judges individually. I think they're all principled. Sometimes they follow the wrong principles, but they're trying hard. But I suspect they see things in narrow slices. The little doctrine here, like non-delegation, which actually delegates power to agencies, or just a little deference here to an agency, but which actually gives away their duty to decide for the law themselves. They see it in these little slices, and so they never look outside those little silos to see the bigger picture, in which all those little slices eventually erode the entire Constitution, our independence, our capacity to act independently, because if we're not being directly constrained, we're being bought by the government, right? The government sometimes issues administrative edicts telling us what to do. I don't know whether it's the government or our betters at Harvard and the like, but if they don't get it that way, they hand out money. And it's our money, and they're using our money to corrupt us with conditions on spending. And so one way or another, government agencies have this massive, deep control of the society. And the current danger, I think, is that administrative control is being aligned with certain corporate control, our employers, our universities, and so forth. And that alignment of interests and policy is very dangerous, because whereas one once had a capacity to find some sort of safe harbor in one's distinct state or institution or religious society, now they're all being aligned through federal policy, whether they're the direct constraint of the conditions. And that's a profound threat to society, isn't it?
Leading toward fascism, actually.
I don't want to go that far, but when it always lurks in the back of one's mind.
Yeah.
By the way, something you said rang very true for me. I know it's a little off topic, but I think it's central, actually. You talked about the importance of everyone standing up for our freedom in our own way. So my mother at age 8 refused to sing the Horst-Wessel Lied and do the Nazi salute. And you would have thought for that she would have been sent to the camps. But of course, it actually saved her immediate family. The immediate family escaped entirely because they had to leave the next day. So standing up, and we're nowhere near that situation, right? We actually are still a relatively free country. It's just a much eroded freedom. So there are no costs really for us. Or at most, you might lose your job. But if that's the case, it's not a job you should really want. If Columbia fires me, I don't think they're going to. They don't want to. But if they were, so be it.
That'll be somebody else's great gain.
And so the risks for standing up for truth are very small, actually. They're merely at most economic or a sense of internal angst. So we should be able to get over that really quickly, right? And you think of Solzhenitsyn's Live Not by Lies. There was really something at stake for telling the truth. Here, we should all be telling the truth vigorously, because that's our freedom, and there's so little cost, at least at this stage.
Although it always starts out that way.
Then better sooner than later. And that, by the way, I must say, I think that's the chief weapon against the administrative state. I think about the way we, at the New Civil Liberties Alliance, we write a lot of briefs. And what actually sets us apart is, I don't think we're so much smarter than other lawyers. There are a lot of smart lawyers out there, and I'm sure many of them are smarter than me, but we are committed just to telling the truth. So if there's a doctrine called, non-delegation doctrine, we say, no, that's not what the Constitution says. It says discuss it in terms of vesting. Or if there's, if judges defer to the agencies, which is crazy, and a matter of bias, against non-governmental parties. So it's grossly unconstitutional. Why don't you just tell them this? And we've found that really works. I mean, on both those issues, the Supreme Court has begun to discuss the problem and almost has voted in our favor. Who knew? And all that's necessary is just to be candid. It's a powerful weapon, truth.
Well, I hope that the court continue to move in that direction, because if you don't put the reins on administrative state, it just continues to expand. It has no reason not to continue to expand. The purpose, one of the major purposes of our Constitution was to prevent the birth and growth of the administrative state. Back in the old days, it was sort of with King James, what did they call it? The authority of
prerogative.
Yeah, and you could do anything you want. It doesn't matter what the parliament or anybody else did. You could just make the exception, and we still have that. We still have exemptions from rules that are parceled out by the agencies, which I became very familiar with as the head of HUD, how to do that. I guess the real question is, whose responsibility and how is it executed to bring the administrative state into perspective where it should be? I mean, I think it was an intentional move, quite frankly, by Woodrow Wilson to sort of bypass what we call today deplorables and have the government in charge of everything.
Yeah, actually, if I may, I'm going to quote from, this is in I call it my little red book rather than the Cliff Notes, in honor of Chairman Mao. But I quote Woodrow Wilson on this, and indeed he made the pretense of wanting equal rights for everybody and equal voting power. But of course, as soon as the 15th Amendment is passed and there actually is a possibility of equal voting rights, he and his friends get mighty nervous because the progressives have difficulty persuading the unwashed masses to actually agree with them. Maybe the people, as you said earlier, are a little more sensible than the academics. So this is what he writes. It's quite candid, so I appreciate that at least. He says the reformer, meaning progressives, is bewildered by the need to persuade a voting majority of several millions. And so because you need to influence the mind, and by the way, I'm quoting him, this is not my language. He says, you need to persuade the mind, not of Americans of the older stocks only, but also of Irishmen, of Germans, of Negroes. And then he says, the bulk of mankind is rigidly unphilosophical, and nowadays the bulk of mankind votes. And so his point is, okay, everyone votes now. Now let's move legislative power out of the hands of the elected people into people, like us, like the
right.
knowledge class.
Take it away from those brutes.
The administrative state is born out of prejudice. It's, people tear down monuments from concerns of prejudice and discrimination. The monument that needs to be torn down is the administrative state. It's actually the serious monument, not just the glitter on a street.
Well, who can do that?
Well, we'll see. I'm trying. You're trying. We're all trying. But if ultimately the people of the United States will do it, I don't think the judges will do it without popular concern, and that's happening naturally, right? Because the excess of the administrative state on one side, they know there's no self-restraint, is provoking a backlash. So people are rediscovering the history that this is actually something barred by the Constitution. And so, I drove my bit by writing books, and I founded the New Civil Liberties Alliance to create this sort of alliance, this New Civil Liberties movement against the administrative state. But I think it's happening naturally, and we're just riding the wave. Although I hope we add a little bit of intellectual push to it too.
Well, one of the things that I found interesting during my time at HUD is that there were a lot of people there who had been there for 10, 20, 30, 40, even 50 years. And they are the people who, given the opportunity, will create all the policies. And that's the case in virtually all the federal agencies. And in many cases, the senators, the congressmen, even the heads of agencies are not nearly as versed in what's going on as these people are. Now, if these people are good people, and if they truly have the welfare of the citizenry at heart, they can do some incredibly good things with the system that we have. If, on the other hand, they have agendas or they are politically motivated, they can create some pretty bad situations, which are incredibly difficult to reverse. You can talk about them. For instance, I remember multiple times talking about some of the things that are in place for people who get housing subsidies, such that if in fact they make more money, they have to report that so the rent can go up. That's not such a great incentive to improve yourself. No. Or if somebody comes into the household who has an income, you have to report that so that your rent can go up. That's not a great incentive for family formation. And there are those kinds of things riddled throughout our government, which are administratively imposed, and they are the dickens to try to get rid of.
It's very sad. You know, I know that the origins of the administrative state are deeply prejudiced, but as to the current lot, I suspect most administrators are very well-meaning. They're very solicitous of the needs of Americans. But of course, not being elected, not being diverse, not being accountable, they don't actually know what they're looking at. They're seeing things through an incredibly narrow lens. So although there may be some that are pernicious, on the whole, I don't think that's true. They just have a narrow worldview and an inordinate amount of power. I've actually proposed a number of times that we should double the salary of all Washington bureaucrats as long as they take an oath not to violate the Constitution. I had no takers on it.
I actually had somebody else suggest that just a couple of days ago.
Whatever works, you know. It's a great pleasure, I must say, to be talking to you about this, because as a doctor, you'll understand things that got me into this that other people don't get. I got into this because of censorship of churches, of religion and science, ultimate things, right? Mm-hmm. And it was particularly the censorship of science that got me into this, yes. So-called IRBs, institutional. Big time. And you know, I don't want to bore your listeners by talking about this, but it's actually pretty important, right?
Yes, well, so all human trials are governed thereby. Right.
And I don't even want to think about the FDA regulations. I'm just thinking about human subjects research. So I was teaching at Chicago and just chatting after dinner with a friend, and he had written an amazingly important statistical article, not a medical article, just using publicly available statistics. I asked, when is it going to get published? And he says, I can't publish it. I said, wait a minute. It's been circulated, by the way, manuscript like Zamzadat, but it could never be published. I thought, that was strange. It's America, you can publish. He said, no, I can't. The Institutional Review Board will punish me if I do. I'd never heard of these things.
Absolutely.
And, you know, over the next few years, I'd wanted somebody else to deal with this because administrative law is so boring, I didn't want to get involved. But after 3 years, I sat down to actually study it and interview people and learn more. And there's a death toll associated with this, as you know, and most non-doctors don't. In this, out of solicitude, of desire to protect human subjects, we ended up stifling scientific inquiry. And I only have one, it's hard to show the cost of chilled speech, but the Pronovo study of catheters implanted into the heart in Michigan intensive care units was shut down by HHS because it didn't get sufficient IRB approval. It's really prior licensing of scientific speech, that happened to Galileo. It's absolutely forbidden by the First Amendment. So, but he managed to publish it nonetheless. And the publication saves about 17,000 lives a year in America alone.
Right.
So if you think about the death toll, if you have just a handful of these important studies that get suppressed each year, we're running
Hundreds
into
of thousands.
hundreds of
Yeah.
thousands, maybe even millions of people dead
Yeah.
since 1972, killed by the government policy that censors people. And it's exactly what we were talking about earlier about using private agents, because they use the universities to censor people. And the universities say, yes, of course, we want your money.
And the interesting thing is most of the people who sit on the IRB boards are very similarly inclined.
Yes.
So
Right.
you know, the people who want to get through them expeditiously, and I've been part of these conversations, is you analyze the IRB, and you know, it doesn't do any harm to sort of study them and find out, you know, what their little peeves are, and because you know that's the way you get your protocols through.
Right, but who knew that we had prior licensing of words? I don't think the Supreme Court gets it. I don't think any of the judges get it. It's its own little discrete area of censorship that is literally killing us. And of course, it's the beginnings of political censorship, because you're very sensitive to everybody's triggering issues.
Yeah. Well, what about your organization? Why did you put that together, and what's the principles?
Well, thanks. I confess, administrative law was new to me. I had not worked on it until relatively recently. And in 2014, I published a book on the subject, Is Administrative Law Unlawful? And that opened up the subject a bit in ways that I think have been very helpful. But having written it, of course, as an academic, I thought, of course, the Supreme Court should turn around on a dime and do what's right. And then I looked at I looked at the litigation, and I was very disappointed actually with the way it was being litigated. I think, I don't want to bore you with this, but there's a terrible danger amongst conservative and libertarians to litigate in response to immediate problems. So if coal is attacked, you gin up a lawsuit protecting coal, and you turn to donors and say, coal is under attack, the sky is falling, give us $1 million, and you pay it to a very expensive lawyer, and you may win or lose, but there's not a way to actually get anywhere, because everybody's fighting in their own bunker and not looking out for anybody else. So we need to be thinking about everybody's freedom. And it's not just about business, it's for all of us, as the IRBs illustrate. So I started a little organization. It's been very well received. We have lots of wonderful lawyers, and we just hired another 3. And the lawyers come from all walks of life, or of all political opinions and perspectives, personal and otherwise. But we're all united in wanting to defend American principles of freedom, namely the right to actually have laws made by the people we elected. And when you get attacked by the government in a tribunal, it should be a court with a jury and your full constitutional rights, which is not normally the case. In any case, we've had some real successes. I'll just tell you 1 or 2. Let me just give one. The SEC. Who would have thought the SEC would be the poster boy for all the incompetent, but it is. So we've been litigating in all sorts of ways against the SEC. We think their administrative law judges are unconstitutionally sitting, and we also don't like their gag rules. They silence people who settle. So we have a lot of litigation against them. They've now reduced the numbers of cases that go in front of their in-house tribunals to merely 16. There's only 16 of these cases left. So they're really, I think, being pushed to a corner constitutionally. And my hope is that soon they will not have any more administrative tribunals. And that will be a major success. It's, I think, important to go after the strongest parts of the administrative state, not the weak ones.
Absolutely.
Everybody else.
Well, thank you for doing that, and those people who have joined you in the process.
It's them, and I love them. It's great. It's lots of fun.
Well, you know, I can tell you that for me, after the election last year, my intention was to retire. I had failed at my first attempt to do so. I said I'll succeed this time. But, you know, there's so many issues going on. I couldn't relax playing golf. And, you know, we started thinking about America, and not so much America, the physical location, as America, the ideal. and how it became such a beacon of hope and freedom for people all over the world. You know, there's an American dream. I don't mean any disrespect, but there's no Canadian dream. There's no French dream. There's no Nigerian dream. There's only an American dream, and everybody knows about it. And the principles that we put in place took us from a bunch of ragtag militiamen to the pinnacle of the world in record time. That was not a coincidence. And so that's what we were thinking about. What were those cornerstone principles that really allowed us to emerge? You know, Alexis de Tocqueville, when he came in 1831 to study America, because the French and the Europeans, they just couldn't understand, how could this fledgling nation, barely 50 years old, be competing with them on just about everything? This is ridiculous. And you know, he just sort of combed through all of our systems. Fortunately, he didn't find a lot of administrative law going on at that time, but he found a system that really worked well on behalf of the people. And he was particularly impressed actually with the input of morality into our systems. And he concluded in the last chapter that America is great because America is good. If America ever ceases to be good, she will cease to be great. And part of the goodness of America is the fact that we have a representative government. We have people who are willing, at least they have been in the past, to work with each other. We had people who didn't censor each other based on their belief system. You know, they're my neighbor, they need help, I'm gonna help them. We're gonna work together to get this bridge built. You know, forget about all this other stuff, because you know, no two people agree about everything. I always say if two people agree about everything, one of them isn't necessary. You know, we just need to learn how to work together. And our Constitution, our Bill of Rights, all of it is put together in a way to allow exactly that to happen. And if we actually follow it, we're going to be in very good shape.
I can't wait to get there. I think you're absolutely right that about the relationship between freedom and self-restraint. There's this. It's a strange combination, but in a sense, we can enjoy greater freedom the more we can actually restrain ourselves in the exercise of it. And that's ideal because one wants the ability to say things that are unpopular, that may be wrong. That's the only way science evolves, right? All great science has evolved because someone said something that was deemed wrong.
Right.
And then, whoops, it turned out to be right. So one needs that sort of freedom, but at the same time, one needs people to exercise it responsibly. And the great danger is with this over control from a centralized, consolidated administrative state with its pinnacles reaching into all the other institutions, is that we will have neither of this. Well, the assumption is we can't restrain ourselves, and so the freedom gets taken away, and we actually need to loosen it up precisely so we can be better people, as well as
Right.
freedom. So we'll see.
Well, one very relevant example in terms of what's going on in the country today, in terms of whether the people or administrators should be in charge, is critical race theory. Is that something that parents and communities should be able to influence, or is it something that a bunch of administrators should impose upon people? And that has implications not only now, but into the future. Because as Vladimir Lenin said, give me your children to teach for 4 years and the seeds I plant will never be uprooted. We need to make sure that we're implanting the seeds that our people, our community, our nation wants implanted, not the seeds that a group of administrators, be they Republican or Democrat, it doesn't matter. If they have come in and they have decided that we are going to plant these seeds because we want to create a certain mentality in people in the next generation, that becomes a little bit problematic. That's really very different than implanting seeds of patriotism, which I think are very good for any nation. A nation cannot long survive if its constituents think it's evil.
It would be useful, I think, if more Americans understood the history of our public schools. Because the founding generation didn't really have public schools. It was all little private grammar schools, private universities. And
then along came Dewey.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, before Dewey, along came the nativists. And in response to Irish Catholic immigration, nativists in the 1840s insisted on the development of public schools. And one of the main goals of these schools is to Protestantize and Americanize these foreigners. Now, of course, a degree of assimilation is important in any society, but when it's organized along lines of prejudice, when it's designed to instill one narrow vision of what it is to be American, it's compatible with religious liberty, but it also creates an instrument that from the beginning was designed to homogenize and indoctrinate. And so personally, I can't help thinking it might be useful for some states to experiment in abandoning public schools. And particularly in current circumstances, there's a risk that the indoctrination is an unconstitutional condition being imposed upon the parents. The parents have a constitutional right to choose the educational message for their children. And when they're simultaneously being taxed and having indoctrination imposed and the schools paid with those taxes, this actually creates a constitutional problem that should not be difficult, although of course it will be because people are so attached to public schools. So we'll see.
That's a very good point. And it's one of the reasons that at American Cornerstone, we are creating the Little Patriots program, basically teaching children the true history, warts and all, of who we are, and putting things in perspective. For instance, you take something like slavery. Now, there are some who want to say all of our history is based on slavery and everything is in some way attached to it. The real history of slavery is that it's been part of every society since there were societies. And there's actually more slavery in the world today than there was in 1863. And we need to be concerned about it. It is evil. This is not in any way justifying it. But it is a terrible problem, particularly sexual slavery right now. So the United States is not unique in having slavery. The place where it is unique, and I think our students need to understand this, is that we had so many people in our country who thought it was evil that they were willing to fight a civil war to get rid of it, and lost a significant portion of our population. 600,000 people when we only had 30 million people. I mean, it was a big deal. And, there were a lot of wounds that were created. And those wounds are still healing. But look at the amazing progress that's been made. We need to talk about that. We need to talk about how progress was made and how we can make even more progress. But we also need to be realistic. And as a neurosurgeon, I can tell you, when I cut that scalp and peel it back and take that bone off and open the dura, I cannot tell whether that is a white brain or a black brain or a yellow brain, because the brain is the thing that makes you who you are. It's not your skin or your nose or your hair.
I was going to say, what makes us who we are is you're able and willing to do that. Some of us wince at the mere thought of it. Courage some of us don't have. It's I must say these issues, I think there are serious problems of race that pervade our societies, but sadly the ones that I think are most dangerous are least recognized. And IRBs were one of those areas. I know I keep on harking back to these things.
Yeah, no, it's essential.
Institutional review boards deliberately tell people that they're going to be subject to more prior licensing or review if you study minorities. And of course, the primary example of this, although it's not specified in the regs, but everybody knows the primary example of this are African Americans. And the net result is it's almost impossible to do work that studies the specific diseases and genetic difficulties of minorities or also pregnant women. As my wife found out, she knows she needs to take certain drugs when pregnant. She cannot find out the right dosage at great risk to herself and the child. Why? You're not allowed to study this stuff without a lot of hackles being raised and a lot of impediments. So even in the most solicitous moments, the administrative state actually does a lot of damage to minority communities. And I think this is a result.
Unintentionally, of course.
Oh, of course, unintentionally. But it's mindlessly, right? And it's because of this, we've turned over lawmaking and adjudication to people on the basis of class and status, rather than on the basis of who's elected and who's independent, namely congressmen and judges. It's a very odd system that says it's solicitous, but actually is indifferent.
Well, classism is unfortunately alive and well in America. And a lot of what people assume as racism is actually classism. And the administrative state is a perfect example of classism. People who basically feel that they have a right to push their agenda because it is correct. Other people just haven't come to the place where they understand that it's correct yet, but they know that it's correct. And therefore, they have an obligation to help everybody else by pushing these things on them.
The most frightening thing that happens to me every year, it happens many times each year, I ask a student, so what do you want to do? And long term. And the answer very often is, I want to make policy. I try to suppress laughter or horror, because what that really means is I want to be a bureaucrat, unelected, on account of my superior intellect, which sometimes is a dubious matter, and intellect itself is not that valuable when unattached to other people's consent. They mean they want to make regulations controlling us, depriving us of our liberty, and making all sorts of misjudgments that they think are just splendid and correct. But yes, that's the danger. Everyone wants to control somebody else. And I think it goes back to, we don't have an aristocracy, right? You're as eminent as anybody could ever be, right? But you're never going to be a lord, and you wouldn't want to be. That's that British thing, right? We're a free society and equal. But of course, people still want to be elevated. So how do you do it? Well, a superior status defined by one's superior point of view, or by one's power to shove it down someone else's throat. I don't know. So we have the class, but it's just not labeled overtly.
Right. But many people have gotten to the point where they end up with a monarchy after coming through a democracy. They go through those 8 stages of civilization. Just before they end up with this domineering society, you see apathy and dependency. Isn't it interesting that we see a lot of that in our nation?
Human nature. Polybius, I think, had something to say about 2,000 years ago. The funny part is, of the millions and millions that self-identify with expertise as decided by one group, and expertise, of course, is different than science, because that's all about questions, not fixed knowledge. But all the people who affiliate mentally with, getting an academic degree and trying to then impose their ideas on others through regulations, most of them don't really understand that actually they're not the ones that'll be exercising power, that they're going to be on the receiving rather than giving side of this. And that in fact, they're going to live straightened lives because of the very power that they endorse, because it's going to take away all of their economic and moral and personal freedom. I think COVID has persuaded this, a lot of people of this. One of our new lawyers, Janine Eunice, was a public defender in New York, liberal, and then COVID happened. She didn't like to be controlled, and she decided to join us because, and this is, I think, utterly admirable, and it delights me, because of a sense of principle to defend freedom. It wasn't about politics. It was just, she began to recognize the threat to liberty from all the control freaks.
Well, you know, COVID is a perfect example of the administrative state and how it does, in fact, try to impose its will. When it would be so much more effective just to be transparent and to show people what is happening. You know, I think American people would not run away from vaccinations if they knew that more than 6,000 people had died after being vaccinated. And that's a much higher number than we would normally see, but it is nowhere near the number of people who would have died without the vaccination. You know, you have to put all that in perspective. So yes, there are risks associated with it. There's no question about that. But what are the risks associated with not getting? And if you give people this information, give people the information that if you've had COVID, you have immunity. You don't need to take a vaccination. You know, I mean, people with normal brains can sort of figure this out. And when you're trying to hide it from them or manipulate them, it just makes them more suspicious. So it's actually delaying things, you know, by the administrators back and forth on all of this. And I think if they would just be truthful, we would not have an issue with this.
COVID really did illustrate, didn't it, that a governor, as the executive, can actually make law, not only shape people's lives, but ruin their lives.
Yeah.
And often in a way that reflects class, because of course the people who are of the employment that allows them to do it by Zoom are much less affected than people who actually have to go to a place of work and do physical labor. So you can ruin people's lives based on class with this mere signing of a pen. And of course, you're here in New York, you know, you look at the nursing homes, what a disaster. And this is precisely what our system is designed to prevent. Law should be made by the people who are elected. And it's bizarre, isn't it? We care as a society, I think everybody cares about voting rights. At the retail level, if any one of us is actually denied one's right to vote, we'll all really be cared. We may, you know, dispute, is this a case, or is that not a case? We'll dispute the facts. But in the end, we'll all care because we want everyone to be able to vote.
Mm-hmm. Well, there is a,
forgive me, I just want to say, but when you wholesale take legislative power out of the hands of the legislature, basically saying you get to vote, but it's a great con game, right? Because the people who actually make the law, well, that's somebody else.
Right.
So it's a great switch and bait. And why do we not care about wholesale deprivation of really one's vote, the efficacy of one's voting rights, even as we can retail about the formality of voting?
Yeah. Well, there is a beacon of light, and that is, you know, last week it was revealed that 41 state legislatures are curtailing the emergency powers of the governor. Because, you know, it is supposed to be in the hands of the legislators. They are the people who are supposed to be in contact with the populace at the ground level. And if it takes this to get us back there, great. But the sooner we get back there, the better off we're going to be as a nation.
Yes. Well, I'm glad your organization, American Cornerstone, is getting the word out to people, because we do have to revert to our principles. They'll get us through this. I don't think it should be controversial that we need consent for legislation, or that we should have a real judge and jury and due process. And so the more word gets out, the better. And it's very important.
Well, I want to thank you both for such a fascinating conversation. I know, Philip, you mentioned that administrative law is not exciting. I would disagree.
It's become exciting. You may not be interested in it, but it is interested in you.
Absolutely. I think, you know, we talk a lot about the administrative state, and most people, you know, criticize it based on economics, you know, whether it's too burdensome or, it's really about how much is the administrative state burdening your life, but it's really interesting to talk about it from this unconstitutional perspective. So I want to encourage everybody to get your book, whether it is your little red book or the Is Administrative Law Unlawful? Yes. And I want to thank you both for your leadership on this important issue. I think most Americans don't realize that, you know, a lot of their life is governed by people who are in fact unelected. And so I think the more people know and learn about this issue, the more we can get out there and change it. So thank you both.
Thank you.
And I want to thank you, Dr. Hamburger, just for being someone who really cares about what happens to this nation and devoting such an incredible part of your life to it. You know, we need more individuals like you. I hope a lot of those law students out there will listen to this Cornerstone, will recognize that they can too have a real impact. But they need to learn about this nation. They need to learn about the principles of this nation, how this nation became a great nation, what we can do to maintain that greatness and to make it even greater and fairer and with liberty and justice for all.